Drum roll. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our show last Tuesday of every month at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Josh and I are the dumb and dumber of Buddha Dharma. And I hope you guys don't mind and just humor us because we're doing it. We're doing it because it's just so much fun for us. Hi, Josh. How are you?
Hey, Denny. Yeah, it's we were talking beforehand about Denny just shaved, and I'm actually growing out a beard for the winter that I've done the past few years anyway, but starting early this year. But anyway,
Well,
it,
had I not shaved today, it would take me another 5 years to get to where you are now. So, yeah, I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to overstaying it by saying that I shaved. I didn't. I don't know what I did, but I probably just took the eraser and just rub it off. But
that's what I
anyway,
was going to
that's
say,
not.
like
That's
the
yeah,
Photoshop eraser, yeah. And then also
yeah.
to tie in what we were picking up last time, we talked a lot about food. And the different Theravada things for monks about food. And here, Denny gets a refrigerator today, and I'm outside picking up trash by the fast food restaurants in my neighborhood. So how about that?
We were not necessarily talking about food, but we were talking about diet.
Oh, well,
That yeah, that
getting
how
alms.
yeah, getting on. So the
Yep.
idea
And
that
storing food too, or not storing
what
food
we
and
were really
selling
talking
it.
about last time was really the comparison between the Theravada Buddhism and the Mahayana Buddhism, and with pointing out the irony of how those two really doesn't describe who they are, because the Mahayana, to be accurate, is really the Chinese Buddhism, whereas the Theravada is, to be accurate, is really more the southern branch of Buddhism. And if I remember correctly, we were talking about how sometimes one side takes something very seriously, and then it turns around and takes something else not so seriously. And we were talking about diet, vegetarian diet, and how the Theravada Buddhism, they can eat meat as long as they're not the one that caused the killing and the suffering, because they do the arm, they go out and beg for food, right? Whereas the Mahayana Buddhism, once they get to China, the Chinese culture just doesn't support begging. It doesn't work for them. And so what end up doing is that they grew their own food. They have to grow their own food, and so then they become very strict in the diet. But anyway,
And we talked about the council and the different rules of dispute, right? The things of dispute.
yeah. So
We
what
mentioned that too.
we kind of went a big full circle, and what we really want to talk about initially was really about American Buddhism. What is the future for Buddhism in America? And I make the point that we're not there yet. We're not even at the beginning yet. And because what I wanted to talk about is how there is no one Buddhism. There's every time the teaching show up in a particular corner of the universe, they almost always fail the first time, and then they have to come back and get localized into the culture. And so in that sense, all the Buddhism that we see in America, they have not been localized yet. So I make the distinction between American Buddhism, which doesn't exist, but it will, because we just have to go through that, and versus what I would call the immigrant Buddhism. The Buddhism that exists today are essentially practices that were brought here by immigrants who happen to come from a different part of the world. And so it's kind of important for us to really understand where they come from and the historical development. And so, should we continue?
Sure, yes, and then that's if there is an American Buddhism, I would say it's in its very exploratory stages or pioneering stages, or development stages. Yes, and then the last two shows we kind of talked about what Denny just mentioned, and also the Theravada and the and the and the derogatory term or Hinayana. And also,
Yeah,
we talked a little about Chinese Buddhism too. So
yeah,
we're going to try
yeah.
to wrap that up, and then possibly, well, Denny, where are we going to lead to today after that wrap up?
Well, we like to wrap up the historical development of Buddhism. And so that gives a context to all the different sects of Buddhism that show up in America, right? So probably America is unique in that we have so many different sects. Whereas if you go anywhere else, you go to Chinese Buddhism, you might see Tibetan, you might see Japanese Zen, but it's very rare. It's dominated by its own culture. So I do want to, the word I was looking for last time was tempest in a teapot.
Oh yeah.
So I do want people to understand that the reason that we want to bring up this thing called the Hinayana, which means small vehicle, is that it is a tempest in the teapot, in that it's a terminology that is used by the Chinese Buddhists to kind of pigeonhole or classify the Theravada Buddhism, and unfortunately, even though we're not supposed to use that word because it's meant as an insult, not so much by the person who is supposed to receive the insult, because he doesn't see it. The Theravada monk don't know what you're talking about when you say Hinayana. It reflects, to me, I really want people to stop using it. And unfortunately, the word Hinayana might not be used, but the Chinese version of that is used every day. It's used every day, and that should be stopped. That should be stopped, because first of all, it's an insult, and it's not even accurate, both in context and in history. So let me just pop up this chart here.
Cool. And it's all about intent too. So if it's intended as an insult, then obviously it's not wholesome, or skillful. And then some people might even use it and not even realize that if the initial, creation of the word was a derogatory intent, and they just use it unknowingly, it's still, it still has that intent built into it as, the superlative. So it's a good point.
Well, I think there's a lot of terms that we use in our everyday life that
Yes.
we just stop using because it hurts people. It's meant to hurt people. That should be stopped. Okay.
Right. If it has the intent to harm, then that's causing harm and ought to be stopped. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or,
so anyway, I think this chart here shows kind of the title is called The Proliferation of Buddhism, and of course it all starts here, and here is the northern part of India. In fact, Buddha, the historical Buddha, was actually born inside of Nepal, and then of course most of his work was done in India. But at the time, like 2,600 years ago, there were no borders. So
present-day Nepal.
Present-day Nepal, yeah. Now, of course, you just look at the timing. So CE is what we call Common Era. Sometimes we use AD after death. So we don't do that because that's Christian. So we just use Common Era. But that's basically 8th century after the birth of Christ. And then when we say BCE, that's before Common Era, or what we used to call BC, before Christ, right? So you can tell that, just kind of pick up. So when we say Theravada Buddhism, that's the yellow part. And I'll have the next chart to talk about how it first, there was a time when Buddhism kind of just spread out, and it came to Sri Lanka. And then from Sri Lanka, it went to Burma or Myanmar. Or some people actually even argue that it went directly to Myanmar. Okay. Now this is Thailand. Now, interestingly, when I have a chance, I'll talk about Buddhism in Thailand. Buddhism in Thailand is actually relatively new. It's less than 1,000 years. It's actually interesting how new it is. And it has something to do with Mongolians, but that's a different story. I'll talk about that. And then eventually, the Theravada Buddhism went to Laos and Cambodia. And
which we don't hear a lot about.
It's a small country. Yeah, it's a small. Those two are very small country, both in size and number of people, and they're just now starting to open up for tourists. So a lot of people from the West knows very little. We know a lot about Thai. Yes. Because it's so open, and so we tend to think that the Thai Buddhism is very old, but my point is that it's actually not very old. It's actually,
and there's some A quick aside, there's some Thai forest traditions here, or in California, Abhayagiri is one of them.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes,
Again, I call that, I call all of that immigrant Buddhism,
yes.
right? So they were here, initially to serve the Thai immigrants, and maybe, but now at one point, Buddhism actually went all the way to Indonesia, which is down here. This is Philippines, but they actually went all the way down to Indonesia. You can see a lot of the ruins in Indonesia. Now, of course, then when the Indonesian became Muslim, then they got kicked out. Okay, so all of that is called Theravada. Okay, that's all called Theravada. Now, then this part is what we call Mahayana, but actually there's two distinct sect. One is what we call the Chinese Buddhism, and one is called the Tibetan Buddhism. Both of them are considered Mahayana Buddhism. Okay, and initially the Buddhism actually went to this region, which is now this is North India, and then North India borders with Pakistan. Pakistan borders with Afghanistan. And what we know about Kashmir is actually right at the Jhāna triangle. So it's interesting that actually Buddhism went to Kashmir first. And actually went to Kashmir and and again, you can see a lot of relics. You remember back when Taliban was in control of the northern part of Pakistan and northern part of Afghanistan, one of the things that they did was that they blew up all the giant Buddha statue. Okay, so that's a sort of a relic of Buddhism, at first, and then from here they actually went to Kazakhstan and all that, and then eventually came into China. So that was the first time that Buddhism was brought into China. Now this says that first century Common Era. So this is like 400 or 500 years after, at least 400 years after the death of Buddha. But I'll talk about this a little bit, because initially when it came to China, it wasn't Mahayana. If you look at the scripture that came at that time, it's actually a lot closer to the Agama teaching, a lot closer to the Theravada teaching, okay, which is very interesting. Now, then eventually from here it went to Korea, and then from Korea it went to Japan. Now, this is actually 4th century and 6th century. This is when Buddhism first went to Korea and Japan, but not Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism actually went there much later than that. Okay, because the Tang dynasty is around 6th century, 6th or 7th century, and when we say the Soto Zen and those are actually hundreds of years after the death of the 6th patriarch, so they're more like the 11th century and the 12th century. Okay, all right. So this is a chart. So what I want to talk next is then what was the initial proliferation of Buddhism, right? So if we borrow this word called proliferate, where did it go first? Where did it go first? Because it didn't have, none of these happens. These was much later. When it first went out of India, it started, and so the next chart is a good one. So the next chart is these are the dates that are kind of more or less agreed upon, except that the Chinese Buddhism tend to think that it's much earlier than that. And there's a whole story on why they think that it's earlier than that, because they have to date it before the birth of Confucius, okay? Crazy. So anyway, but this is internationally, this is what we sort of agreed on, okay? That Buddha was born, and then Buddha passed away, and he was 80 years old when he passed away, and then a king Asuka, and then eventually there was what we call a council. So historically there has been three or four councils. We're only going to talk about 3 councils. The first council was right after the death of Buddha. Was immediately after the death of Buddha. It wasn't exactly immediate, but only because they have to wait until the end of the rainy season, and they have to wait for people to come back. And so Mahakassapa is the most senior. Did I pronounce that right, Josh?
That sounds right.
Okay, all right, Mahakassapa. Maha just means big.
Mm-hmm.
Maha means big. Now, let me talk about this. So Kassapa is the name of the 3 brothers who actually brought about 1,000 students to Buddha. So Buddha was not in the retail business. He was in the wholesale business. He didn't actually have 1 or 2, he didn't get students one at a time. So when we talk about like the suttas, we say, oh, we always say like he had 2,500 students. This is always the sutta, they say that. The first 1,000 students came from 3 brothers who also have the name of Kassapa. And so the oldest brother brought 500, and then the younger 2 brothers brought 250 each. And so there's a lot of discussion on that, because that was intentional, that Buddha decided that what he wanted to do was to really enlighten the leaders, the religious leaders, and then they brought them with them. Now, that also explains why Buddhism is so complex, because when you talk about the different sects, they actually start with, they already exist before Buddha. They actually exist before Buddha, and Buddha kind of brought them into the fold. And so they each have their own kind of uniqueness, not because of Buddha's teaching, but because of the initial condition.
Okay? Now you're talking about like they were ascetics before, right?
And they were ascetics before. They have their own methodology.
Okay, and then they came under the, they joined the Buddha's kind of order, right?
Right.
So, and then as a side note here, an addendum, that there's plenty of suttas too that where just here and there people would come to see the Buddha, or he would encounter people and they would end up joining too, but it was more kind of an individual one. But you're talking more of the massive, or the mass amount.
Correct. Yeah. So the first Buddhist council is there's no controversy on that. Everybody agree on that. That immediately after the death of the historical Buddha, his most senior student, Mahakassapa, called together 500 of his disciples, his most senior disciples. These are all arahant, and the word Theravada meant the venerables.
Except for Ananda that's an interesting story. He was an arhat, but just at the last minute before he joined, right? So,
well, the reason for that is that he couldn't be an arhat. He couldn't join
unless he was an arhat.
He wasn't even a bhikkhu. Because had he been
I'm talking about the first council.
I understand that. What I'm saying is that Alanda, who was Buddha's cousin, born on the day that he became enlightened, who later on became his attendant, he had to be a novice monk, because had he graduated himself to become a full-blood bhikkhu, he would have been sent away. So he didn't want to be sent away. So he never actually practiced. He was the guy. He was like me, just like, except that I didn't use my memory. I used my video recorder,
But I'm talking about that to be able, since he memorized pretty much all the teachings, right? He had to.
Correct. So he had an agreement. He had an agreement with Buddha in that he had to attend, for him to be the disciple, he has to attend all the lectures. And not only that, but if he were to miss one, for example, if Buddha had went to a different realm for his teaching where another couldn't follow, he has to come back and repeat it. So that's why he has this incredible photographic memory, and so he was invited into the council, except that he wasn't a arahant, because he never actually. So it took him 3 days.
And then the interesting part is, he was trying so hard, and at the last minute, right when he was laying his head down to go to sleep, is when
you have to give up.
Arhatship, right?
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, the moral of the story is that the harder you try, the worse it gets. You know, the Taoists, if in the future we'll have we might have a time to talk about the Taoist teaching, and you know the Taoist teaching comes from Lao Tzu, you know, and his writing was something called the Tao Te Ching. I don't know the English, and in there there's a very famous phrase that says that, you know, if your purpose is to study as if you're, you know, like book knowledge, then you would gain every day. You know, the more you study, the more you gain. And then it says right there, it says, but if your purpose is to practice, then the more you study it, the worse it gets.
It's about, surrendering. That's a great story for surrendering, relinquishing, abandoning. Those are all languages used. Renunciation. So yeah, those are. But it's most people in the West think of those things as a negative thing. It's more about renouncing and abandoning, the unwholesome, the unskillful.
We need to talk about that in the future. So let's continue with this. Okay. And so the purpose of the gathering wasn't even about Ananda. It was about another senior student, and the reason for that is that as soon as Buddha passed away, all the students kind of say, "Hey, we're free," and then Mahakassapa said, "No, not so fast." So he called the council, and they spent most of the time, really put together a set of rules, a set of for the monastics, And then only after they did that, then they call upon Ananda to say, "Hey, let's focus now on." Let's now agree on Buddhist teaching. So when we talk about the suttas that are studied in Southeast Asia, the Theravada, all the Theravada teaching, they came from that. They were passed. Of course, back then there were no written language, but they were actually passed on from generation by oral, by essentially you call that Hein, singing, right?
Say it again.
Singing, they actually.
Oh, sing. Yeah, it's because Pali is such like a lyrical language, and the Buddha's teachings were kind of, excuse me with my eye there, were structured so where it has like a refrain, like a song, and it repeated over and over again for memorization. We also have to realize that this is what was heard. Right, it's not exact. It was based on the level of kind of accomplishment of whoever recorded it as well. And like I think we said earlier, one person will say one thing, but if another person says, "Oh, I don't remember that," well, then it didn't go in, right? There had to be consensus.
Correct. So it was very, very. So they were throwing out things more than they were accepting things. If one disagrees, says, "I didn't hear that," and so, well, then okay.
And which is amazing because the Pali Canon is so massive, the three baskets.
Yeah. I don't know, so then that's what we call the first council. So that's the beginning of all the Theravada teaching. Keep in mind that the Chinese Buddhism, the Tibetan Buddhism, that wasn't even in the horizon yet. Okay. Now the second, interestingly, and we talked about that last time. So this is in some way this is still a review. The second council happened about 100 years later, and so. Either 100 or 200, but 100, let's say 100 years later. And it came from a disagreement between two different groups of monks, two groups of monastics. And it has to do with the issue of money. And the original teaching of Buddha was that they have to renunciate. So when they renunciate, they have no use of money. Now, of course, he did that because all his students were like super rich. Like they were just super rich. So they have, in order for them to be his student, they have to give up, right? So they have to. He would make them into beggars. That's what bhikkhu means. And so then, of course, as time goes on, it becomes impractical, and still they would not accept money. And so the story was that then they put a pot. And they allowed the disciples to throw money into the pot, and then they would collect it indirectly. And so the other side said, no, they can't do that. And so they had this big powwow, and that was sort of the split, the initial split now between Some people would argue that they're the Mahayana and the Hinayana, but that's actually not accurate. But it is accurate that there was a split. And
always about money, huh? It comes to this.
Religion is all about money.
Well, I mean, just pretty much
organized religion is all about money. Yeah, it has always been about money. And one of these days,
and the systems we're living in now as well. But I mean, that's for good and bad. Yeah.
Well, money. Keep in mind that religion is a language, and money is another language.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. And it's an idea at the heart too. There's an idea.
So we talk about that. There was this 10 points of controversy, which very interestingly, the money was the last one. The first one is about salt. Yeah. It was about, can you preserve the offering? If you get enough today, in other words, is it okay for me to carry an icebox with me, right? That kind of thing, right? And so the very rigorous orthodox sect says, no, you can't do that. You can't even carry salt, because the original Buddhist teaching is very clear that you don't do any cooking, you don't do any farming, you just go out and beg for food, and you do that once a day, and you pick a random direction, so you're not repeating yourself, and you go down 5 houses. It was very, very clear. And so every house, you don't enter, you knock, and you don't say anything, and if they don't come out offer you food, you go to the next one. And if you go through 5 and you didn't get any offering, well, then sorry, try again next year. You go hungry. But if you go 5, you can't go to the 6th. And if you go through 3 and you have enough for the day, you still have to do 5. You can't stop it, when you get enough food. So it's very, very rigorous. Can't accept money.
You just have your bowl. Just have your bowl out.
Just have your bowl, and you cannot preserve them for tomorrow. If you get too much, you have to. If you take what you can, and then you give it to the poor. It's very, very clear.
This is about an ascetic lifestyle, but a middle way, not too ascetic where you're starving yourself, but you're reliant and dependent on the community, and also you're out there amongst the community, regularly, and not just off, on the mountaintop all the time. So
yeah, it actually practices 2 of the 10 parami, right? Yeah. The monks are practicing. He's practicing the what's the word that you give things away? What's
generosity. Yes.
The people are practicing generosity. He's practicing renunciation.
Yes.
So the monks are practicing renunciation, practicing being humble and being disciplined, and then the normal people are actually practicing generosity and also equanimity. Yes. Because you're supposed to offer and not expect anything back, right? So it's actually part of the practice. So anyway, so that was the second Buddhist council. There's not much disagreement on that. The important things here is really the start of the beginning of the split, of different people's interpretation. One being very, very rigorous, don't change a thing. And the other one says, well, the world's changed, so we should change with it. Now, finally, the most important person in the, again, proliferation of Buddhism is King Asuka, right? So he was born about 300 years after Buddha. He wasn't a Buddhist to begin with, but he became one. And then he decided that he really wanted to tighten up because he just saw too many people are not following what he would consider the Buddhist teaching. So then he got all of them together, and then there was a third council. So the third council was really to first kick out all the non-conforming monks. And then they got together, and this is actually the beginning of so we talk about the 3, we talk about the 2. One is the disciplines, the Vinaya. The second is the Buddhist teaching, which is the Sutta. And then there's a third. The third are all the writings by the monks. Okay, and that started with the third person. So when we talk about what's Abhidhamma.
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 Well, there's
Yeah.
some controversy, not controversy, but there's differing opinions in that, and I'm not really qualified to talk about that yet. But
Hmm.
the other ones are commentaries too. So that's like the third.
Yeah.
That's the third basket. So those are
Yeah, yeah,
commentaries
and
on the original teachings. And
that's not unique to Buddhism. All religions are like that.
that's
All
right.
religions are like that. So
There
you,
are
I mean,
some
for example,
enlightenment
in
poems too to throw in there. So
yeah,
that
I
the
mean,
other people
look.
they
I mean,
write poems
I
after
know
the
nothing
Enlightenment.
about Islam, but I do know that
Yeah.
in Islam you have the what came from Muhammad, and then you have other stuff that came from other scholars, and people don't necessarily study the Quran. They could be studying something else. So this happens a lot. So then what's interesting is that once he got all the documentations together, and they start to say, okay, here's a set of complete set of teaching with the three parts: the what came from Buddha directly, called suttas; a code of conduct, we call the Vinaya; and then finally the something like the Abhidhamma, some of the commentaries, some other things that are supporting interpretation. So all that together, it's like the encyclopedia now. Okay, so now it's time to send out the encyclopedia salesman. So the history is that the King Ashoka actually sent out 9 different missionaries, 9 different groups of missionaries. The one went as far as Greek. And so actually, like in the museum in San Francisco, if you go to the top floor, the Asian Pacific Museum, you go to the top floor, they would have the different Buddhist culture, and they would talk about how the Buddhist statue, how they change over time. And there was a period where it looked very much like the Greek artwork. And so that was heavily influenced by, so the Buddhism went to Greece, and then it came back with the artwork. Okay.
And speaking of that real quick, this is a kind of a fast forward and then a quick rewind. I just got a book, haven't got into it yet. It's called The Search for the Buddha, The Men Who Discovered India's Lost Religion. Basically about, how it died out in India, but then it was rediscovered by some of these Westerners. So it's, I've heard a little bit about it, so I'm looking forward to reading that.
So it went as far as Greece. I mean Greece, I don't mean Greek. And then it went to Kashmir. We talk about that. And then it went to Myanmar and Sri Lanka. Okay, and that was in the 3rd century. So if I now go back to, the first slide, So this is what happened is that during the King Asuka time, the Buddhism started to propagate, and it went to Kashmir, and from Kashmir it went to Greece, and went to Afghanistan, Kashmir, all that, and then it went to different parts of India, and then it came down to Sri Lanka, and then it went to Myanmar. So that was in the 3rd century BCE, before Common Era. Okay, so that hasn't changed. Practically it hasn't changed. In terms of what the appearance, the practice, the literature, that hasn't changed. Now, so that's Theravada. That's Theravada Buddhism. So what happened with the Chinese Buddhism or the Mahayana? So again, let's go back. Let's go back to why the word jhāna. So again, last time we talked about the Lotus Sutra, and there was a analogy of an old man with his clan. He's trying to get them out, and the house was on fire. And so this is really like us, who are so still very much enjoying a material existence. And so the old man is like Buddha. He's trying to get us, enlightened, going back to being an enlightened entity. And so he pulled out these 3 different carts. One is pulled by a deer, and one is pulled by a horse, and one is pulled by an oxen. So the idea is the small vehicle, the medium vehicle, and a large vehicle. And so what Buddha was basically saying is, well, the small vehicle is about practice of yourself, how you would relieve of your own suffering. okay? And then the middle vehicle, and then the large vehicle is about helping as many people as you can. But he meant it as progression. He didn't meant it as a choice.
So what about the middle vehicle, though?
The middle vehicle is I forgot the word. I know the Chinese word. It's people who become enlightened on their own without actually studying Buddhism.
Oh, it's it's the private Buddha, right?
Yeah.
Is that the one?
Yeah, they can
okay.
actually just so people think that the Taoist, the origin, the first patriarch of the Taoist, the Lao Tzu was one of those, that he was able to enlighten without actually
without the
studying
Buddhist teachings or
without the
teacher,
Buddhist teaching.
Right?
Yeah, he's fully capable of doing that by just observing the nature, the rising and failing of the nature, and so
but that's different than full Buddhahood, though, right?
No. Well, I mean, it's all a path.
Oh, you can still get there, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Well,
absolutely.
the historical Buddha, he had teachers, but he had to end up abandoning them,
I guess what's important to me is that people think that there are three different choices. They're not three different choices. There's three different progression.
It's a progression, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I always said that you can't be a lifesaver. You can't without knowing how to swim. That makes no sense to me. Right. And on the other hand, you can't be an expert Olympic swimmer, without wanting to be a lifesaver, because then it's all about you. That makes no sense either. Right. Because in the end, to be a full Buddhahood, to be fully enlightened, you have to have compassion, loving kindness, empathy and equanimity. You can't hide in a cave and become a Buddha. It doesn't work like that. Right. Anyway, So that's the word jhāna. And so unfortunately, the Chinese Buddhism interpreted as a choice as opposed to a progression. So they focus on Mahayana, which is the way of the Bodhisattva, focusing on helping others, thinking that in the process you will help yourself. That would be like saying that I don't know how to swim, but if I put on a pair of red trousers, red shorts, and become a lifesavers, and something happens, I'll jump in the water, I would be an expert swimmer automatically. That makes no sense to me. But anyway, I don't know. Okay, so what's important to so then after it went to the South, Sri Lanka and Myanmar, then it died out in Europe, right, because of Islam. So then it went to China, and when it first went to China, it was first century. It was within 100 years after the birth of Jesus. So just looking at that, you can see that there's a difference of 400 years. Just looking at that, right? That when it first went to Sri Lanka and when it first became the practice of the Theravada, to the point where it went to China, it's already 400 years, except what is called the Mahayana didn't even start there. Didn't even start when it first. So when it first came, the most famous relic of how Buddhism went to China is this temple, or this pagoda called the White Horse Pagoda. There's a very famous, so when you talk about the Silk Road, so this is in fact the Silk Road, right? So this is in fact the Silk Road. Let me go back. So this is in fact what's called the Silk Road. Okay, there's another one that goes down, but this is in fact the original Silk Road. And so there's somewhere in here, there's a very famous pagoda called the White Horse Pagoda. And this was first century. So this was in 67 Common Era. Okay, so it was 67 years, and two monks actually came from Kashmir. It actually came from Kashmir, and then they settled into Kazakhstan, and then they came into China. And the story was that one day the Chinese emperor had a dream, and the dream was that there was really bright light from the west, and so he called in his prime ministers and whatnot. And he says, I had this dream. And so one guy says, oh, that was because a great man just was born in the West. And so he says, well, then we have to send people there to find out what's going on. So he sent a whole bunch of people. And then this group kind of left the capital and worked towards the west. And so, of course, they were complaining about how they had to live the life of riches, to go west, where there's nothing but desert. And then halfway there, and they saw these two monks, carrying all these books on the back of a white horse. And they said, well, where did you come from? He says, well, we came from the west. We were going to bring these teaching from Buddha to you. And he said, well, then, that's the end of a journey. Let's go back. So they built this white horse pagoda, and so the two monks live in this temple, and they start to translate. And so the first sutra that they translate is called the Sutra of the 42 Chapters. And it's a very simple. The style is very much like the Theravada teaching. Okay, so that wasn't even Mahayana. That was the original. And now let's go back to
that was in Sanskrit, but where did that come from? What country or?
Well, the two monks supposedly came from a part of not Tibet, but this is Tibet. But there's another one here called the where all the Uyghurs live
Mongolia?
now. No, Mongolia is up here.
Okay. Yeah.
No, there's some controversy now. Xinjiang.
Okay.
This is the part that is very controversial right now because all the minorities, all the Uyghurs live there, and all the Han Chinese, went in there, and there's a lot of problem here. So they were actually traveling scholars. So even though they came from that part, came from Kazakhstan, they actually originally came from Kashmir.
Okay.
But they were traveling, and their idea was to travel to China, bring the teaching to China. And so there are three sutras that are very, very famous that were from that era. You probably know them. One, Master talked about, I wish I did. Well, anyway, the 42 chapters is one.
Mm-hmm.
I know the Chinese word, I just don't know the English word. There are two others. They're very famous, all three.
Is it the 30 verses? No, that's not.
Master actually taught one of them one time.
Oh, the retreat I was on, we did the 8 realizations of great beings, but I think
exactly.
Is that it? Okay.
Yeah, that's another one, and then there's one more.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so those are very famous. Those are very famous.
We'll think of it here in a second, maybe. But I'm wondering. I always loved tracing the origins, and it drives some people batty. Like where did it come from in Kashmir?
It came from that era. It came back. So this is worthy of another show. It's really the original pre-Mahayana Chinese Buddhism
writings. Yes.
Yeah, writing. Because there's another story that there's another set of sutra that came from the south, which came because we talk about the
guy that did the elephant thing, right? The guy that rode on the elephant and went to get teachings in India.
We're going off a little bit, but just quickly, we all talk about this one monk, the Tong monk that went to India. Well, there was another one that predated him.
Okay.
He actually went there on land, and then he came back on sea. And interestingly, when he came back, he went to Sri Lanka, and he took with him what we call the Agama Sutta. Let's talk about that in the future. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that there's a 400-year difference between Buddhism first went to Sri Lanka and Buddhism went to China. Except that there's another 200 or 300 years difference between when it first went to China and then what eventually became Mahayana. And the only thing that I don't want to give a lot, the details are not important. What is important is that, again, we're going back to how in every place that Buddhism goes, it has to get localized, that it failed the first time. And so when we talk about the Buddhism going to China, it was all about renunciation. So if you read the 3 sutta, the one that you talk about, which is the 8 realization, and the one here with 42 chapters, it's another one. It's original Buddhist teaching. It's all about renunciation. It's all about practice. And all that. That didn't work for the Chinese.
We forgot Bodhidharma. That's
Bodhidharma is much later. Bodhidharma
much
is
later.
much
Okay,
later. That's
so
that's another 700 years later.
Okay, yeah. So we got a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah. So in order for it to be successful in China, it again, it had to be localized. It cannot just be translation. It had to be localized. So one example I use is that when I travel, especially when I travel to Southeast Asia, I love visiting McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken. When I'm in the States, I never go. And the reason is that I'm not interested in the American version of McDonald's or the American version of Kentucky Fried Chickens, because all of those have failed. And what I'm more interested is the localized version of the McDonald's and the localized version of the Kentucky Fried Chicken. And they are interesting.
Yes, yep.
They are really interesting.
We mentioned the pizza effect, or I mentioned the pizza effect last time.
Yeah, we talked about pizza.
Kind of similar, like it was it was like pizza went to from Italy to New York and the States, but then whatever happened with pizza in the United States went back to Italy, and they incorporated that there. But it doesn't seem like America's.
So it's the localization that is interesting. So again, the original idea of wanting to talk about American Buddhism is that American Buddhism doesn't exist yet. It will exist, and it will exist when we finally take the teaching and localize it to our need. Okay, so what we have today in America is not yet the American Buddhism. What we have is immigrant Buddhism. Okay, and so, but even in China, in order for it to be successful in China, it had to integrate Confucianism and Taoism. Okay, so when we say Mahayana, what we're really saying is Chinese Buddhism, and Chinese Buddhism is this crazy mix of Buddhist teaching, Taoist teaching, and Confucius teaching. So there is no pure Buddhism. So if you say, okay, I want to study Mahayana, I want to study Chinese Buddhism, just keep in mind that you're studying Buddhism in China. Okay, now, because that continues. So now when you talk about Tibet, so here is how it says that the 8th century Tibet. Now, this is actually not true. When Buddhism first went to Tibet, it came from China. And so there's a very famous princess. There's a very famous princess that was married into Tibet. At the same time, a very famous princess was married into Tibet from Nepal. So this king in Tibet actually had 2 wives at the same time, one from China and one from Nepal. They both brought with them their version of Buddhist teaching. And in fact, we talk about the Guanyin Bodhisattva, and then we talk about the what's the green and the white
Tara.
We talk about Tara.
White Tara, yeah.
Now, so there's many different colors. There's red Tara and there's all that, because in Tibetan Buddhism, most of the figures are male. So even in Guanyin has mustache. Okay, so they had to kind of have this female version of all these, because in order for them to practice convey compassion, they had these females. These females are called Tara. And so the story is that one day Guan Yin flied over Tibet and you see all the suffering, and she or he shed 2 tears, and one was the green Tara and one was the white Tara. The green Tara was the princess from China, and the white Tara was the princess from Nepal. And so they brought the Buddhism into Tibet. Again, that was immigrant Buddhism, right? And it failed. It failed miserably. I mean, it lasted about 100 years, and then it failed. And so the Tang Dynasty was 8th century. So the Buddhism actually went to Tibet 200 years before, what is said here, which is the 8th century Common Era. But it died. Then Buddhism kind of resurrect itself by going back to India and bringing the teaching back to Tibet. But by that time, it had to be integrated with its local religion. Bon. Okay, and Bon is an animalistic religion.
Well, I think that what is the term that is used? It's
Shaman.
Or shamanism or animism. I think.
Animism. Yeah, but that's okay. That's okay, right? That's okay. I mean, before Catholicism became the religion, the state religion in Italy, what do you think they worship, right? Everybody worshiped that. And so then what we call Tibetan Buddhism is another mixture, unique mixture between what they would perceive as Buddhist teaching and then the local culture. And so there's a lot of ritual, and those predates Buddhism. Okay. So very quickly, Buddhism went to Korea. And it wasn't 4th century was not the Bodhidharma came to China in the 6th century. So this predated Zen, okay, and then eventually Bodhidharma came into China and brought Zen meditation into China. And then he was the first patriarch, and then we now talk about the 6th patriarch, which is another 100 years later, 7th century now. And then eventually the Zen. So after the 6th patriarch, then there were 5 different schools. Okay, so from the 1st to the 2nd, from the 2nd to the 3rd, and so forth, it was actually like 1-to-1. It was really 1-to-1. Now, I hope when we talk about
by that you mean like a transmission from master to student, or
from master to student, and then one
old
student,
lineage holder to the new lineage holder, right?
Yeah,
Patriarch.
It wasn't. So there's a very, very famous saying called the 1 branch, 5 leaf. So there was just a 1 branch from the 1st to the 6th, and then 5 leaves go to the 5. So what we know about the Japanese Zen Buddhism, we call the Soto Zen, and then we call the Rinzai Zen. Those are the
Rinzai,
two of
Rinzai, yep.
Rinzai Zen. Those are the 2 of the 5 branches. Now, very quickly, we will talk about Qi and Qigong and talk about Yi Jing Jing. Okay, so Master always talked about Yi Jing Jing like he learned that from his grandfather. Okay, he always say that he learned it when he was 5 years old, and then eventually he came to the United States, and he met this one chief monk, venerables, Minchi, who was the chairman of the Buddhist Association in New York. Okay, and then one day. This monk decided to teach Master, and after he taught Master repeated it right away. And so the monk, the old monk, was very surprised, and Master said, "Oh, I already learned that from my grandfather." Okay. Well, what Master didn't know, well, he knew what is that this Munchi monk was the 49th abbot of a very famous temple in China. And of course, in 1949, when the communists took over China, everybody left, right? Those who were behind got killed. Buddhism no longer exists. The temple was completely destroyed. So he was the 49th abbot. Well, the first abbot, or maybe not even abbot, the guy who actually built the temple was a student of the 4th patriarch. So I have every reason to believe that the Yi Jing Jing that we learned from Master was handed down by Bodhidharma himself.
Very well could be. Well, and where did his grandfather learn it from?
Well, his grandfather was a Shaolin, he was a disciple of the Shaolin martial arts school. So there's that. Yeah.
Then real quick, how do we explain for the other versions of the Yi Jin Jing? Isn't there like two other main versions?
We'll save that for another show.
Yes, yeah, we'll have to do that.
We'll
Yeah.
save that in another show. Okay,
Much, yeah.
So then I want to talk about Zen Buddhism. How did it first Buddhism went to Korea in the 4th century, but actually the Zen Buddhism went to Korea in around the 9th century. Okay, in 9th century, because it had to be after the 6th patriarch, right? It had to be after the 6th patriarch. So it went, and today we call it the sun meditation. SON, okay, that's in Korea. That's what it's called, sun meditation, and that's basically Rinzai, mostly Rinzai, okay. And then from there it went to Japan, and Rinzai went to Japan in around the 12th century, and there was a very famous monk from Japan that went to China and brought Rinzai.
Oh, not Dōgen, the Soto.
No, that's much later.
Okay.
That's much later.
Much later.
So it's important to understand the difference between. Did I say the right Rinzai?
Rinzai, I think it's.
Rinzai. Okay,
I've heard it
fine.
pronounced before. Yeah.
Okay, it's very important to understand Zen Buddhism in Japan, because Zen Buddhism is very popular in America. It's very popular in America, and you have to understand where it came from. Okay, so first of all, they actually came to Japan in the 11th or 12th century, first by way of Korea, and then eventually in 1187, a monk went to China directly and brought it back. Now, this is very important because the Rinzai Buddhism was the basis for what we call the Bushido. Bushido is the way of the samurais. So the Zen Buddhism the Rinzai Buddhism in Japan is a little bit different from the Rinzai Buddhism in China, in that after it came to Japan, it had to be localized again. And it got localized with Shintoism, which is the worship of God. And then it also got mixed in with Confucianism. And it became the basis for the samurais. So when we talk about Qigong, in the future, we talk about Qigong. Qigong is really like just the body. It's not even, it's the body, it's the concentration of the body. It actually, the ultimate goal is not thinking. Not thinking in the sense of not using your analytical brain. Therefore, you react without hindrances. That was the basis for the samurai, that if they practice meditation, they became a good swordsman. And their sword would be so fast, and Master actually talk about this, that if they cut someone, it was so fast that no blood remain on the sword. And the only reason they could do that is because they're completely in control of the 5 hindrances. So they don't let that interfere with their reaction. Okay, so the people who study, the people who are listening to this, some of them are studying martial art. They will study the Yili trend, and they talk about that too. They talk about no thinking. Okay, so then
it slows everything down and takes too many resources, right? By the time you put language in or images in your head, then you're already lost time in reaction time, in action time. Yeah.
Correct.
And then also, real quick, there's Rinzai in the Linji. There's parallels between Rinzai in Japan and the Linji lineage of Chán, right? But that's another.
Correct. Yeah, the pronunciation is different. Pronunciation, but again, I just want to point out that it had to be localized.
Yes.
And it localized in Japan by combining Confucianism and Shintoism, and then it eventually became Bushido. Okay, and what's interesting is that if you look at the history of Japan, is that the samurai up until then were servants. and they were working for the the royalties, the aristocratic, and then eventually, because of Bushido, they became more powerful. And so the Shogun era, okay, the Shogun era was one where the power resides with the samurais, and the court was just for
commoners, peasants.
The court became just symbolic.
I see.
And so that continued until like the mid 19th century with what we call the Meiji Restoration, when Commodore Perry was sent by President Roosevelt to open up Japan, and then they decided that the only way that they will survive is that they become modern themselves. And so they switch. This is the time when they switch, and they give more power to the emperor, and they took away all the power from the samurai. So if you watch the movie from Tom Cruise,
yeah,
that's the story. Now, what's interesting is that this is when they do that, then they have to elevate Shintoism. They have to elevate Shintoism, and so then they push down Buddhism. And so when one of the things that we talk about is the Buddhist monk in Japan, they can eat meat, they can drink alcohol, and they can have wife and kids. That's not the history. That only happened in the last 150 years.
Politics, right? As with
because they go back, they took the power away from the samurais, from the shogun, they give it back to the emperor. In the process, they elevate Shintoism, and then now Buddhism has to survive on its own, and the only way that they survive on its own is then they became family business, and they were forced to have a wife, they were forced to eat meat.
Otherwise, it could have died out.
Yeah, otherwise they couldn't die out. Now, okay, so let's go back to Rinzai. So Rinzai was brought into China, and it was embraced by the samurais because that was the way that they can practice their swordsman and all that. So then, I would say another 50 years later, less than 100, another monk, Dōgen.
Dōgen, yes.
Dōgen went to China, and he brought back a different sect called Soto sect. Okay, Soto sect. Then he brought it back, and it was meant for the commoner. And so there's a very famous saying. It's called the saying is called Rinzai for the shogun and Soto for the peasant. And Soto Zen became much simplified, very, very simplified. And so the Rinzai is focusing on what's called a kōan. You have this like
kōan, yeah.
Kōan.
That's pronounced in the West, I guess.
Kōan. Where you're supposed to
what's the sound of one hand clapping, right?
That's a very famous one.
A lot of Westerners know some of these, yeah.
Yeah, very, very, very famous. Again, the idea is that it's a no thinking. So you're supposed to confuse your mind, looking for an answer that doesn't exist.
It's a riddle. Yeah, you can't have a logical answer to it.
Yeah. So if a monk, sorry. Yeah. Go ahead.
How do you feel? How do you fill the C in a sieve? In a colander, right?
So it was supposed that thousands of those. So they're customized. So the master would give that to the student, and the student come back and say, "I figured it out." He got kicked out of the mountain. Now, what's interesting is that Soto Zen, because it had to be simplified for the peasants, then there's a very famous saying called Shikantaza, which translates in English into only sitting.
Or just sitting, yep.
Just sitting. Now, I have a little bit experience with the Soto Zen, and so that's what they do. They just sit. They just sit. That's what they do, and so it's another method. Okay, so I think that's probably what we should do today.
Yes.
We'll pick a topic for next week. So
again,
in summary, I just wanted to say that I look forward to the day when we actually have quote unquote American Buddhism. And we could very well be a participant in that, into figure out what Buddhism means for Americans or Westerners. Yeah.
And hopefully it won't include celebrities or reality TV shows, because that's pretty much the religion of America.
I think we had enough of that.
Exactly. Well, that's America's religion almost, you know. So how are you going to
incorporate?
That is. Yeah.
That
so
is,
maybe
that
when
is.
when that fades away, then we'll we'll incorporate something else from America into
I actually think that, well, I don't know if that is the answer, but my answer is that it has to integrate with science.
Well, and a lot of that is already happening. You know, you have these monks that will go into machines and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about duality of particle and wave, that's very consistent with practice.
I have to agree with this once we get some of the issues out of science, because science has almost turned it into its own religion now. It's become a scientism instead of.
So I think at the very minimum, we have to reconcile with science.
Yes.
Okay. We have to reconcile with Christianity.
Yep. And Thich Nhat Hanh wrote that one book, Living Buddha, Living Christ. But I don't know how much of an impact that had. But yeah, that's another thing that came to mind as well. Yep.
And finally, I believe it has to reconcile with capitalism,
or whatever economic system happens after all this.
I believe that. I think going forward, I'm hoping that that this is Renaissance. America is we have enough of the other way. Let's try a different way, and maybe compassion. Well, maybe there's such a thing as compassion capitalism. Who knows?
Right, and it's all it's a great experiment here in America, the melting pot, and lots of experimentation.
Listen. Every day, I try to remember what the world was like when I was born. Okay, we were the first family that had a refrigerator. We were the first family that had a radio. We were the first family that had a television. When I came to America, 15 years old, 1971, we didn't even have plastic bags. There were no plastic bags. When I went to college,
be a good thing, though, now.
When I went to college, we didn't have microwaves, so there's no packaged frozen food. So I am sorry. I am responsible for destroying the world.
In a way,
but on the other hand, if there's money to be made in destroying the world, I bet there is money to be made in restoring the world.
Yeah,
I bet compassion. I bet compassion capitalism is another. It's as good a way of making money.
Yes, the true, honest, the real version of that, not just pandering and having window dressing and making yourself, I don't like the word virtue signaling, but unfortunately some of the stuff that people are getting into, which is a good start, a lot of it is just a false veneer of goodness, when behind the scenes, a lot of stuff is still going on, but it's a start, better than just outright exploitation of everything.
It's worthy of a try.
Yes.
Right.
Of doing, because there's no trying, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, anything else, Josh?
That's it. And Denny, it's been a pleasure, and I
gotta go down and try out my new refrigerator, get some ice cream in it, and see if it melts again.
All right,
I still remember the day I was 5 years old and my uncle brought a refrigerator.
Isn't that cool? I mean, I hear these stories from my grandparents and folks.
It was really nice because I saw ice in there, and and then when they melt, it became water. And then I remember, a mile away from our home, it was the place where they generate electricity, and they have cooling towers with water flowing down, and I couldn't understand how the water could get from the cooling tower into the refrigerator.
You had the Iceman come and bring it to you, right?
No.
Oh,
this was a refrigerator. This was American-made Emerald. Come on.
Because I know they used to have people bring around ice, and then.
Oh no, that's called icebox. That's not called a refrigerator.
That's right. Okay, so that was
Okay. I really enjoyed this, Josh.
It was great.
Really enjoyed this. Yeah. Okay, let's do it again.
Okay, next month, same time, last Tuesday around noon.
Put that on
and then Denny wants to. can join Denny's new venture or continuing reimagined venture on Zoom, right?
Yeah, so we have a, thank you for that, Josh. So we have a practice on every Saturday at 8 o'clock Pacific time. And there are two ways you can join. So this is like the David Letterman show. You can watch it on TV or you can come to the studio, okay? If you want to come to the studio, you go to dennykmew.com/fellowship. So then you can buy a drop-in ticket, and then
which is free.
We can participate on this thing called Zoom. So we can see each other and practice together. So basically, it's a 1 hour of exercise and meditation. Actually, it's all meditation. It's just that the exercise itself is meditation. Now, that's if you want to come to the studio. Okay, this is David Letterman. So if you just want to watch it on TV, we actually last week started to do that on YouTube. So if you subscribe to this channel and you click on the bell, then you will get a notification on email when we start the show on 8 o'clock Pacific time on Saturday. All right. So Josh, you have something else too.
Well, yes, shameless plug that you can read some of my work and see what I'm up to at integratingpresence.com. It's 2 words, integrating and presence.
Next time put the .com in there, Josh.
I didn't put the .com in there?
No.
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 I don't know if there's enough room on this.
Oh, maybe not. Maybe not. Okay, so it's simple enough. Integratedpresence.com. Yeah.
Integrating. Let me spell it real quick. integratingpresence.com.
There's a lot of good stuff on that. A lot of good stuff. Yeah. Okay, with that, thank you.
All right.
See you next week, next month.
Yes.
Hope you enjoyed this.